We talk about it all the time. The other half of what NIF Australia does, not just in Israel, but in Australia, is to have important and challenging conversations inside the Jewish community to lead the discussion here about how to shape that better reality on the ground for Israelis and Palestinians. People in Australia, they take notice of that, and we're thrilled to have been able to, over the years, have been able to host some internationally iconic authors, politicians and activists to join our event, to give us support, to share their views with this incredible community that we have. And tonight we're thrilled to have Senator Penny Wong, Australia's Shadow Foreign Affairs Minister. She's joining us to talk about some of the threats facing liberal democracy around the world and what Australia can do and what Australia's role can be in Israel-Palestine. So welcome, Senator Wong. Thank you for joining our event tonight celebrating 10 years of NIF in Australia. I want to start with the big picture, and hopefully you can give us a sense from your perspective of what are the big threats facing liberal democracies like Australia, like Israel, around the world today.
Well, first, congratulations on 10 years, and thank you for your continued contribution to our democracy. I really respect and appreciate the contribution all of you, and you personally make. Well, democracy is under a fair bit of pressure, isn't it? And to reflect why is that? What are some of the drivers of that? We would look at populism, we would look at disinformation, we would look at the erosion of trust in democracy, and obviously also, I think the rise of intolerance and hatred. I would make this point, and I try to make it quite often in the domestic political debate. Democracies do depend or require a certain degree of acceptance of facts in order then to have a democratic contest around, given those facts, what we then do, whether it's on policy or the way forward. And I fear that we, in this era of disinformation, in this era of fragmented media, in this era of people listening to other people who think like that, our capacity to actually collectively understand facts and then be able to contest the path forward on those facts is diminished. And that is really bad for our democracy.
Is there has there been a broader erosion beyond the kind of public discourse, a broader erosion of democratic values that you're worried about? In Israel, we talk a lot about, threats to the independence of the judiciary, threats to minorities, which goes kind of beyond just racism in the public square, but also sometimes from the top down in government as well. How do you even begin from a place in the parliament to try and address those sometimes kind of overwhelming systemic issues?
Yes, I sometimes fear that people's understanding of history is poor, and that the lessons of the 1930s, which is not actually just about fascism, etc., but it's actually about the erosion of the principles you describe and the road that sets countries and the world on. I think we always have to continue to advocate and express and support the sorts of principles you just described. And the Jewish people and the Jewish community in Australia, I think, because of the history, the tragic history and the tragic experiences of the Jewish people, have understood that principle matters, universal rights matter, principles which are abstracted from individuals and institutions, but are important as providing those guardrails for democracy. And we have to, they always have to be argued for. It's not like you win them and then you can sort of set and forget. Every generation and within generations, each time, we have to continue to advocate for them.
When you speak about the history of the Jewish people and understanding the collective trauma that we've been through, that's so much of what our message is. So much is about we understand what trauma is like for us. How can we make sure that not only, and Israel is one of the kind of materializations of it, that Jewish people have a place of refuge, but actually these lessons are applied so broadly. This is what we speak about in terms of tikkun olam and healing the world. So how do we make sure that those values permeate so much more widely? How do people who maybe haven't had that familial experience of trauma, how do human rights issues become apparent to them? How does it become relevant to them in their everyday lives to understand this shrinking global space for human rights?
That's a really good question. Well, I mean, I think domestically or internationally, I mean, I always believe that you have to locate these sorts of principled discussions to some extent in people's own experience or experience with which they can empathise and sympathise, and to explain, why we believe in, certain universal rights, not just in the abstract, but what this means for um, people, or either them or people like them, or people with whom they can identify and empathise. I also believe that um, talking about the counterfactual is useful. So to take through people through, in the absence of the separation of powers or in the absence of universal human rights, things like arbitrary detention or whatever particular outrage you might want to reference. These are the things. These are the things which can occur, and so why we argue for these sets of democratic values and these principles and these human rights is because we recognise what can happen to humanity and to communities if we don't protect them.
So, I mean, we don't have all that much time. I'd love to hear maybe more about whether you personally get despondent, but
At
seeing all these
times,
kind of catastrophes unfold, and you being in the center of the political discourse. But I do want to make sure that we focus on what NIF people really kind of want to hear about always, which is about Israel-Palestine. And so I was hoping that you could give us an overview of where you see and where Labor, I guess, sees Israel-Palestine today, and your analysis of what's happening on the ground.
well, I mean, can I make a comment about the domestic discussion?
Sure.
Because I think that might be a useful way to sort of start it. I mean, I think, this is a very an issue about which people feel very deeply, and it gets imbued with a lot of history and a lot of um, you know, emotion at times, and I understand that. I wanted to say I think that the way forward, certainly for the discussion in the Australian community, is to ensure that people can speak and hear, listen respectfully. I don't pretend to know everything about the current state of the government and the modern state of Israel. I would make these points. We're a steadfast friend of Israel as a party, and the history of our involvement in the founding of the modern state. It's a friendship that continues today. However, we would continue to assert the sorts of principles and rights and that we've been discussing. But most of all, when I went to Israel, one of the things that really struck me was the extent to which there were two narratives, both of which had, historical basis, both of which had a lot of legitimacy and experience, and they were not narratives that were able to be heard by either side. Now, I hope that changes, because it seems to me, that the prospect of peace, a just peace, will only occur if that happens. And I want to, in conclusion, if you want me to finish up, is to say I really thank you and NIF for the respectful way in which you engage in this discussion.
We appreciate that. I will keep you for another couple of minutes if I can, which
Sure.
is to ask about what Australia can do. Australia's only a
Mm,
middle power. We're not at the at the front of the table, but certainly Australia is in a unique position because it does have such a strong and long friendship with the state of Israel, and also with the Palestinians, both in terms of aid and diplomatic support.
mm,
So Australia is kind of unique in the global context, or at least has a very strong role that it could play.
mm.
What role and impact then can what we talk about in Australia and what we do, either under you in opposition in the form of Labor government at some point, is able to talk and further that agenda?
Yeah, I do think in politics often just actually being principled is a good idea, and I think on this issue to be principled, to be clear about our view on issues that we don't agree with, where and we have been on annexation, the expansion of settlements, those issues which we considered to be um, inconsistent with a just peace and a two-state solution negotiated between the parties. Equally, where there is some of the sort of behaviour we've seen from terrorist organisations, that should be called out. And I think in all of this, to continue as I have sought to have dialogue with representatives from different perspectives and different communities here in Australia, but in our public position, to be really clear, you can be a friend of Israel, but you can also be principled about the issues that you raise concerns about.
I think that channels exactly what NIF is trying to do, to
Correct.
be, tribal in the way that we are dedicated to the future of a homeland for the Jewish people, the inherent justice in that, but knowing that, making sure that we stay true to our principles of human rights, of equality, of democracy for
Yep.
all is that way. And from our perspective, the only way that can happen is by ending the occupation, and the only way that can happen is by bringing about a negotiated peace between Israelis and Palestinians. So, thank you for joining
And that
us.
and that way, I think security for two peoples
Exactly right.
can be found.
Exactly right. Thank you so much for joining us, Senator Wong, and look forward to seeing as much more of you as we can.
Great to see you, Liam.
Thanks so much.